Okay, now we're going to continue on in Chapter 6, the muscular system. All right, graded responses. This is where muscles are organs with many cells. So a graded response is where they react with different degrees of shortening or contracting. Now this is produced two ways. You can change the frequency of a muscle stimulation, so how fast, or change the number of muscle cells that's actually being stimulated. So let's look at frequency first. A muscle twitch is a single brief contraction, where a tetanic contraction is a fused complete tetanus. Now, you get a nerve impulse that comes fast, so the muscle cannot relax between action potentials. So the contractions are actually added together, giving you a stronger, smoother contraction. Let's look at the picture and see. All right, to the left, you can see a muscle twitch. That is a single brief contraction, just one action potential. But notice through B, C, and then finally D, you're getting more frequent action potentials, so the muscle can't relax, and then you end up with D, which is a nice, good, fast, rapid, good contraction. Now you can see these with the arrows, which are purple underneath. Notice at the left, you got one action potential. Then at B, you've got three, but they're pretty spread out. By the time you get to D, they are back-to-back firing. Another way that we can have a graded response is by a stronger stimulus, meaning that you're recruiting more muscle cells. So fewer cells stimulated, a littler contraction or smaller contraction. All motor units stimulated, you get a massive contraction. All right, so let's look at this illustration. If you look in the middle where it says the proportion of motor units excited, that's how many cells and all the good stuff that you're actually stimulating. Then if you look up top, this is showing you the strength, how, what size of contraction you're wanting. And at the bottom, it's the actual contraction. So if we look, the first two stimulus and the first two pictures of the motor units, no motor units are being stimulated. So the action potential is not strong enough yet to actually even get a contraction. By the time you hit the third circle, there are two motor units that are being stimulated, so you're getting a very tiny one. And then you can simply move on to about the sixth sixth circle showing the motor units, and almost all of the muscle cells are being stimulated, so you're getting a much stronger contraction. By the time you move to seventh circle, every single cell or motor unit is being excited. So that is the maximum contraction. You can send a stronger impulse, which is happening up top, but it doesn't matter. You've got every possible cell working. Energy. You have to talk about energy when you talk about muscles. Muscles, unfortunately, store very little ATP, but they require a lot. So they have three ways to generate ATP. First, direct phosphorylation of ATP. 2, aerobic respiration. And 3, anaerobic glycolysis and lactic acid formation. Let's start with direct phosphorylation. Here you have creatinine phosphate, called CP. It's only found in muscle cells, and it's a high energy molecule. All right, this is what we call quick and dirty. Now, all we have is CP interacts with ADP. Basically what happens is ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. Remember, we want ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So ADP is going to steal a phosphate from CP, thus making ATP. Quick, super easy, but unfortunately, because it is so fast, it doesn't make a lot of ATP, and it's quickly exhausted in seconds. The best way to make ATP is aerobic respiration. Aerobic means with oxygen. 95% of ATP comes from this process during moderate muscle activity. Now, this takes place in the mitochondria. Again, it does require oxygen to take glucose and break it down to water and carbon dioxide. Now, you get roughly 32 to 36 ATP. there's still a lot of controversy on that, from breaking down bonds in the glucose. Now, you get a lot of ATP, but it's slow. So that means that you got to have the time and you got to have the oxygen available. Anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means without oxygen. Okay, so there's no oxygen, so you know you're not going to get as much ATP. Here, glycolysis turns glucose into pyruvic acid. Without oxygen, the pyruvic acid enters, with oxygen, the pyruvic acid enters the aerobic respiration pathway, and you get, again, 32 to 36 ATP. Without oxygen, the pyruvic acid enters an anaerobic pathway, and you only get 2 ATP. That pyruvic acid will then become lactic acid. Now, it is faster than aerobic respiration, but it uses more glucose and ultimately ends up with less ATP. So, looking back, the direct phosphorylation and anaerobic glycolysis are fast ways for the muscles to make ATP, but you don't get a lot. Whereas aerobic respiration is slow, but it gives you the most ATP. Alright, so we look on the left, you have the direct phosphorylation, where ADP is stealing a phosphate from CP, making ATP. Again, fast, quick and dirty, not a lot of ATP. Anaerobic is in the middle, and this is where, again, you are not using oxygen, and you take glycolysis and you make 2 ATP. However, if oxygen's available, then you get to jump into the aerobic pathway, where it takes longer, but you'll get the most ATP. Alright, muscle fatigue. Fatigue is where the muscle is unable to contract even when stimulated. This typically results from oxygen debt from over-exercising. Now, it's dependent on the blood vessel supply. So obviously, if blood is carrying oxygen, the better blood supply you have, the less likely you are to go in oxygen debt. Now, it also is based on lactic acid accumulates. This causes soreness, because why is lactic acid accumulating? Well, remember back to where we just talked about ATP forming. If there's no oxygen, then pyruvic acid forms lactic acid, and that's why you get sore. This is why you have to do cool downs after exercising. That allows your body to take in oxygen, thus taking that pyruvic acid and making ATP instead of jumping and making lactic acid because there was no oxygen. Now, deep breathing after the whatever activity or exercising helps provide that oxygen to replace ATP. Alright, types of contraction. Alright, tension develops in all contractions. You've got isotonic contractions, where the myofilaments slide or move, so the muscle shortens. This gives you movement, like walking. Isometric contraction, the myofilaments trying to slide push against a wall, so the muscle doesn't shorten. You get no movement. These are posture muscles, so it's still contracting, but you're just not moving. Muscle tone. Okay, that is not consciously controlled. Our body does it involuntarily. Now, some fibers are always contracting, ready to go when needed. If you destroy the nerves to the muscle, then you'll lose that tone. That's what typically happens, like if you're paralyzed. Over time, that muscle becomes flaccid or soft and wastes away, which we call atrophy. So that is a big problem with like your bedridden patients, your paralyzed patients. Exercise. Use it or lose it. Alright, aerobic or endurance exercises. These are stronger, more flexible muscles will be produced. You have an increase in blood supply to the muscles, and muscles have to form more mitochondria because remember, that's where we make the most ATP. Resistant or isometric exercises is where muscles push against immovable objects. This increases muscle size and strength. You get enlargement of the muscle cells, but not the number. The connective tissue also increases. Activity rules. Well, muscle has to cross at least one joint. The bulk of the muscle will lie proximal to the joint, so near the joint, but not actually over the joint. At least two attachments for the muscle, an origin and an insertion. Muscles can only pull, they never push. And during contraction, the muscle's insertion moves toward the origin. So let's look at that movement and talk about origin and insertion. Origin is where the muscle is attached to the immovable or less movable bone. Insertion is where the muscle is attached to the movable bone. So that moves toward the origin. All right, now let's move on to body movements. All right, you have flexon. Flexon is where you decrease the angle of the joint. So in the picture to the right, this would be you're bending your head down. Or you could take your arm and lay it out flat and then pretend like you're flexing. Go ahead and bring your hand up, and you should see that your elbow will be at a right angle, your forearm to your upper arm. Now, when you did that movement, you were decreasing the joint angle above the elbow. That's flexing. Extension is increasing the angle of the joint. So again, if you look at the picture to the right, that would be taking your head from a down position to a straight position. And in your arm, it would be putting your arm back out flat. Now, hyperextension is increasing the angle of a joint past 180 degrees. So you can't do that with your arm, but you can with your head. Again, that would be like looking up at the stars. Rotation. This moves around the long axis. Abduction moves limbs away from the midline. Adduction moves limbs toward the midline. So you can see the pictures to the right. Now another example of abduction and adduction would be your leg muscles. So if you look at your thighs, your inner thigh muscles are adductors because they're moving limbs toward the midline. Your abductors would be your outer thigh muscles moving away from the midline. Circumduction is where the proximal end is stationary. The distal end moves in a circular motion. Dorsiflexion is lifting the foot toward the shin, so toes up, and that's referring to the angle on top of the ankle. So if we look to the picture to the right, dorsiflexon is decreasing this joint angle. Now, plantar flexon is toes down. So now we're referring to the angle on the back of the ankle. So again, flexon, remember, is decreasing the joint angle. Supination rotates a forearm, so palms face anteriorly. Pronation rotates a forearm so that palm faces posteriorly or down. Now, movements usually require two or more muscles. You have the prime mover, which is the muscle with a major responsibility for causing a movement. So if you are grabbing your book and picking it up, and that exact motion, just not moving any other part of your body, just reaching down and picking something up and pulling it towards you. Your biceps is the prime mover in that. An antagonist is a muscle that opposes or reverses a movement. So your triceps, which are underneath your upper arm, those would be antagonistic in that same movement. Now, moving on. A synergist. This aids prime movers, produces the same movement, or reduces any undesirable movements. Where fixators will stabilize the origin and hold the bone still, which puts tension on the insertion. How do we name muscles? Lots of ways. You can name a muscle by the direction of the muscle fibers. Rectus means straight, so you have the rectus abdominis, which the fibers run up and down. Oblique means diagonal. So you have internal and external obliques in your abdomen. And again, you can see the fibers running diagonally. We can also name a muscle by its relative size. Maximus is large, minimus is small. You have brevis is short, and longus is long. Location of a muscle. Okay, well, temporalis muscle, that lies on the temporal bone. You have several that work in this way. Number of origins. Biceps have 2 origins. Triceps have 3, and quadriceps have 4 points of origin. You can also name muscles by the location of the origin and insertion. For example, the muscle sternocleidomastoid, which is the large neck muscle, and that originates at the sternum and clavicle and then inserts at the mastoid process behind your ear. Now, we can also name them by the shape of the muscle. Deltoids are triangular, and trapezius or look like a trapezoid. We can also name them by the action. Adductor group in the thigh, adducts legs. You have flexors, extensors, all kind of muscles. Okay, couple of little questions. While working out at the gym, your body consumes all the oxygen in a muscle cell. This ATP producing process will take over and form lactic acid. Which of the following are we talking about? Direct phosphorylation, anaerobic glycolysis, aerobic respiration, or a graded response? And the answer is B, anaerobic glycolysis. The external oblique muscles are named for their A, activity, B, shape, C, fiber direction, D, size. The answer is C, fiber direction. Jumping rope involves which type of movement? A, hyperextension, B, dorsiflexion, C, circumduction, or D, supination. And the answer is C, circumduction.